good number of you joined, so welcome. I think it's probably a good time for us to kick things off. The webinar that we've got today, some of you will have been on the webinars that we've been running throughout lockdown, throughout the pandemic. And we've been running a lot on how to survive the pandemic, how to get our businesses to survive, to maybe even in some cases thrive. We've run a lot on topics around looking after your employees, particularly around mental health. But this one on leadership, I see very much as being the first webinar that we've run in this series about looking up and out. What's ahead of us. I think leaders have been under pressure over the last 18 months, like possibly never before. Some of us that have gone through previous recessions, I think maybe have seen something similar, but nothing in any way like this, where where we've all been through a serious lockdown and serious threat of illness. So I think it's really important now that we start to look up and out. Ian and I have known each other for a long time, and I know that very much Ian is all about the role of leadership in businesses and particularly passion for smaller businesses. So this is how to get ahead as things open up. Ian, as I mentioned, we've known each other for a long time. Ian's an executive coach. He's my executive coach. We've been working together, for 3 years, 4 years?
Yeah, maybe
a long time.
Maybe longer. I don't know. I always underestimate how long I've worked with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ian's a very experienced executive coach. He's got a lot of business background. He's a TEDx speaker, so he's gave a very popular talk on TEDx, which I'm sure we'll touch on. And he's also the author of the book, The Leadership Map, which is kind of we're going to use as the framework today for the content. Oh, and I should also say he's got a very popular podcast called the Gritty Leadership Club, and grittiness or grit is something that we'll touch on later. That podcast is with another person that we know well, Ben Wales. So Ian, I've given you a little bit of background. Give us something about yourself.
Well, married with 2 grown-up kids. I'm at that stage where they're both leaving home. They're 19, so they're going to university, which is always a sad part of our lives. But I spend most of my days with leaders. So some of the stats make me think I'm probably doing too much, but then when you love something, it's hard to stop things. So I coach about 40 leaders, CEOs, key executives. In the last 2.5 years, speaking to Vistage, which is groups of CEOs and key executives, I've done about 90 speaker workshops, which is 3 hours in length, on all subjects around leadership. As you said, I do the podcast with Ben Wales. I blog every month. And I do leadership programs. At the moment, I've got 3 leadership programs running across different companies, all SMEs, and 1 new client just opened up in Singapore, which is really interesting. So loads of stuff around leadership, and like many, I'm sure, on the call, I spend a huge amount of time also absorbing and growing myself, because the thing is with this subject, you never know it all, and the more you know, the less you believe you know. So, absorbing podcasts myself, reading, watching, and trying to grow my knowledge of this really interesting subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff. All right, brilliant. Thanks for that. A couple of bits I forgot to touch on in the housekeeping. We've got the chat going, which a bunch of you have found already, so that's great news. We've also got the Q&A section. Love to take your questions as we go. So we'll be constantly looking at the Q&A. So if you've got a question, if you want us to give you clarity, then please drop the question in. If you see me a lot looking to the right-hand side, it's because I've got my screen open with all the chat and the Q&A, everything. It's not because I'm doing my Facebook. So that's there. So please interact with us. Very much this is kind of a chat, and we want to take it where it's going to be most useful to you. But just as a way of kicking things off, Ian, how have you seen, whilst this is a forward-looking thing, I think it's interesting to recognize, how have you seen leaders react, respond, change due to lockdown? You notice any trends?
Yeah, I noticed trends they changed through lockdown. I think when people went into lockdown, it was really important for leaders to grasp what was going on, as Jim Collins would say, the brutal facts, what's happening. And I think some people got caught off guard. Some people were really up to what was going on, and to create scenarios about what might happen to their businesses and then react accordingly to one of them, engage their senior leadership teams and engage their whole organizations. I think the ones who communicated really well, and of course it became a different form of communication, didn't it? It became this sort of communication over screens, which is, you've got to work a lot harder. I know I did a lot of presentations on Zoom, and it was way harder to do this and engage people and know they're engaged with you. So I think leaders had to get used to that. I think they put a lot of technology in if they were smart, and they looked at home working. And a lot of the things we put in place aren't going away now. And I think we realized we were going to have to be creative. We were going to have to look at opportunities. We went through all the emotions, didn't we? And leaders were no different. There was the denial, the fear, the anxiety. And as leaders, the best ones came out and were as clear as they could be about the situation we were in, how we were going to manage it, where we were going, that our vision was still valid, that we had a real underlying purpose, that we were going to work according to our values. And they created some assurance for people. People needed that, because for a lot of people, and there is still that going on now, of course, and I've been talking a lot to groups this week about the fact that we're kind of coming back. We feel we're coming out of the pandemic, but we're not really. The pandemic's still there. The COVID's still there. It's not going away, and people are still anxious. So there's never been a more important time for leaders to communicate, to have clear messages, to really reiterate where we're going as a business and what we're trying to achieve, and get them back to some of the basic things. And so, yeah, I see the best leaders doing that. They've taken their people with them. It's extraordinary what some leaders have done. I've seen leaders come out of this, a lot of leaders come out of this in a better position than they went in. And that makes no sense when you think of some of the challenges we've had. And, I know organizations where they furloughed 900 people out of 926. And you think, how did they survive that? And that organization I'm thinking about, which was Team Sport Indoor Go-Karting, run by the exceptional Dominic Gaynor, I've come out flying. And because of his exceptional leadership, he did exactly what I said. He scenario planned, he put videos out there to his teams, he constantly communicated, he kept people in touch, and constantly kept people focused on where this business was going, and reassured people.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that the biggest change that we made to get into lockdown was forced on us. So it was change management overnight, and we made that massive change. But now the challenge is actually, how do we come out? Yeah. And there's going to be no forced coming out. So yeah, absolutely, I take that. But the term, we've used the word a lot, leadership. What is a leader? Is it nature or nurture? Is it introvert, extrovert? What's the difference between a leader and a manager? There you go, throwing a whole load of questions at you there. Pick whatever you will from that.
So I think there are a few, might I say, natural leaders. That doesn't mean they can't learn and grow and become better leaders. I think that's what every person needs to do. I think most leaders I work with, and I'm very privileged to work with a lot of leaders, one day they're a manager and they get trained in management. Lots of management courses they go on, and which are very about controlling things and running things and operationals and P&L and balance sheet and all that stuff. Then they're promoted maybe to a head of a team, head of a department, maybe CEO. And they sit there and they go, what am I supposed to do? Which is what I did when I became an MD of a company back in '97. And I thought, what on earth do I do now? I'd done an MBA, but that didn't help much. And I think that's the thing. I mean, if you look at people like Peter Drucker, they've kind of defined the two, management and leadership. And management's about the sort of control and making things happen, implementing things. It's quite left brain. And leadership tends to be more about the vision, being creative, challenging the status quo, developing and growing the people around you. Those are the sort of traditional ways of dividing the two. In terms of introvert, extrovert, I mean, that's an interesting one. I think you'll probably find, if I sit with the groups I work with, they're probably split 50-50. I don't see any advantage to being an extrovert necessarily as a leader versus an introvert as a leader. And if we look at the kind of science behind introvert extroversion, introverts tend to think things through a lot more before they say things, and extroverts tend to say things while they're thinking things through. There are a huge number of introverts who are really successful leaders. I think, unfortunately, in the press, we kind of focus on the extroverts because they're the ones that tend to get our attention. But no, I think it's really split down the middle.
Split down the middle. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good. Look, let's dive into some of the concepts around the leadership map. Now, if I understand it correctly, the book was very much your way of distilling everything you've learned over the years and the examples and the things you've seen in practice about what makes a great leader, maybe actually how to become a great leader. And I see we've got a question in, can leadership be taught? Is it innate? And it's a combination, I think, isn't it? It's a bit of both.
Definitely.
And if I see your book, it's sort of a way of saying, right, let's bring a whole bunch of tools, a whole bunch of examples into one place so it can be very much a reference guide. And the start of the map, the start of the journey is what you call the strategic decision filters.
Yeah.
So what are they? How does it begin?
Yeah. So when I started putting the book together, I wanted to figure out, what's the order? What comes first? If you're starting a business, what do you need to put in place first? So that's why I put these four together: purpose, vision, values, and strategy. And why are they strategic decision filters? Why do they call them that? Because when they're in place and you're very clear, they help you make decisions. So let's start with the first one, purpose. If you look at Disney, pick a big example first. Disney, creating happiness is their purpose. If you go and Google it, you can find it. They say our purpose is creating happiness. As a decision filter, what does that mean? It means that when I'm in a park and I'm seeing customers around me, or guests as they call them, I want to make them happy. Whatever I can do to make them happy, that's my purpose. I might have a job, but if I'm on purpose, I'm doing that. I'm making them happy. If we're producing a film, we're making people happy, and so on. If you go to an SME, again, I'll pick Team Sport because I work with them a lot, like I've worked with Breathe. It's creating unique and exciting experiences for everyone. So again, they can look at that as a decision and filter and say, is everyone coming in? Have we got something for everyone here, from kids right the way through to grandparents? Are our experiences still unique, or are the competition now doing something we're doing? So how unique do we keep it? Are they exciting? Are they exciting enough? Are they too exciting? Have we got health and safety in there? So as a purpose, you can have an individual purpose. You can have an organizational purpose. So for me, it's interesting. When I started this journey all those years ago, I started thinking, I remember actually, I met a guy called Brad Waldron, who you'll know well. You've used him in Breathe. Great Australian speaker.
He spoke at our last conference.
Fantastic. I love Brad. He's superb. He spoke to a group of CEOs I was working with. And at lunchtime, I sat next to Brad and I said, that was a great session, Brad. And I just said, what keeps you going? What keeps your energy here? Because he's a guy with huge energy, as you'll know. And he said, well, do you know, Ian, it's because I'm on purpose. And it stopped me in my tracks, him saying that at the time. And I said to him, what do you mean? He said, because this is what I do. This is what gets me out of bed. And if you think of being a nurse or a doctor or a fireman, you automatically think they're there on purpose. They had a purpose. My nephew, he wanted to be a pilot from the age of 4. He is now a pilot. So he feels totally on purpose. And, it made a big difference when I started to put my world together. I think, what do I do and what sits at the heart of it? And that became inspiring leadership. I want to get out of bed and inspire people to be leaders. That's what I want to do. And everything I do fits around that purpose for me. So that's purpose.
Yeah.
There are 3 other bits to that. Vision. I believe organizations can't, for example, sit down as a leadership team and decide what they're going to do next year unless they've got a longer term vision of where they want to be. Otherwise, they're just kind of building off this year. And so it's really important to think, and I don't think too far out. I subscribe, and I'll probably drop a few references in here. Cameron Herold wrote a book called Vivid Vision. Really like his book. It talks about having a very vivid view of what it would be like if you wake up in 3 years' time and your business is flying. What does that look like? And so you do need to have a view of where your business is going to be in, say, 3 years' time. I think 5 years is too far ahead. 3 years, and then you can build your strategic priorities, your goals, your targets off that. Values, obviously, Breathe have got a great set of values, growth mindset being one of them. I think often we talk a lot about values, the heart of a business, the culture, the DNA, and we have to live it. We have to recruit on it, induct on it, appraise on it, do our one-to-ones around it. The behaviors are so important. And then finally, strategy. Now, strategy was the interesting one for me, because when I started putting together a chapter on strategy, and if you start Googling strategy, there are a million different versions of what it is, and some people, you say, what's strategy? And Ben and I have discussed this on a podcast. And if you say to some people, what's strategy? They'll tell you everything from mission to vision to purpose to strategy to strategic priorities to meetings. And you'll say, well, that's fair enough, but, okay, but what strategy? So I went back to Michael Porter. Michael Porter was the guy that I studied at Henley all those years ago. And he said it's your sustainable competitive advantage. So for me, strategy was about how you are different from the competition and sustaining that over time.
Right.
So with that in mind, my view on strategy, which I put in the book, is around what some people might say is positioning. It's, so you've got to be good at everything to run a good business, but where are you going to be exceptional? And that can be about product excellence. It can be about customer intimacy or operational excellence. And I think, if you look at Breathe, I know what you're going to say, you're much more about customer intimacy, but you've got those other things which you've got to do well too. So to me, it was about getting people to focus on, we've got to be really good at some things, but where are we going to be different from the competition? And that applies if you're a coffee shop on the high street or if you're Tesla. It really does. Yeah. These things apply to SMEs as well as the big guys.
Just I want to move on, but let's just step back for a second. We've had a question in from Alison, and I think it's a really useful one, is just focus for a second or two on the difference between a purpose and a vision.
Right, yeah, that's great. And I get asked that all the time. I would say a purpose grounds us into why we do what we do, why we exist. It's not about where we're going. So I would say the purpose grounds us to, it's the Simon Sinek thing, where a great TED talk, if you haven't seen Simon Sinek's Start With Why, the Golden Circle, he talks about people buy why you do what you do, not what you do, they buy why you do what you do. And I think with businesses, it's the same thing. When you can walk into a pitch and say, why we exist at Breathe is to do this. Why we exist at Tesla is to do this. Why we exist at this. And you can get passionate about that. So that's why we exist, why we came together. And often as the founder of an organization, you may not have written it down, but it's in your head. And you kind of need to extract the juice out of it and put it down. The vision is different. The vision isn't why you exist. The vision is where you want to be in, say, 3 years' time. There is a useful, I find it's, the purpose thing is harder. These things are hard, by the way. I can spend, a half day to a day with leadership teams trying to help them to articulate their purpose or their vision. And so these are hard things to do. One of the things I came across is, well, first of all, I came across a book called The Blue Zones, which talked about the people who lived the longest around the world, centenarians. One of the areas they looked at was Okinawa, the Japanese. The Japanese in Okinawa live to a ripe old age. And one of the reasons they say they live to ripe old age is because they have a real purpose. And they have this thing called Ikigai. And Ikigai stands for a worthwhile life. And Ikigai has 4 parts to it. It's really useful. I use it for organizations and senior leadership teams to try and find their purpose. So these 4 areas they have is what you love, what you're passionate about, what the world needs, and that comes back to kind of like your products and services, what you're really good at. So there's no good saying, well, the world needs this, we're not good at it. So what you're really good at, and then what you can be paid for. So the sort of economic engine that Jim Collins talks about in the hedgehog concept. So those four things are quite nice to sort of reverse engineer what might sit at the heart of them, which is a purpose. So purpose is who we are, why we exist. A vision is where we want to be.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Hopefully that answers your question. And I think just to wrap up this part of the section, I personally found that it's okay not to know what your purpose is. It's okay not to know what your vision is. Maybe even not to actually have written down your values, so long as you're on the road to finding them out, to writing them down. And we at Breathe, we've been through in the years we've existed, we've been through a number of different versions of purpose and vision, and our values have changed as we've grown. They haven't changed drastically, but maybe we've refined them, we've honed them. We've developed as we've grown.
I agree. These things aren't set in concrete. People often ask me that, can I ever change my values? Yes, of course you can. You can. Yeah. You're more likely to tweak your values rather than change your values. But your vision must be looked at regularly. And your purpose just might be tweaked a little bit to say, the point is you've got to be using these things, looking at them, thinking about them. When many organizations came into the pandemic, they said, as a decision filter, what does our purpose tell us we should be doing? What do our values tell us how we should be acting? How does our vision help us to move through this pandemic? So a lot of great organizations were using these things.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of really good questions come in. Can you have a vision without a purpose?
Well, some people have a kind of a mashup. I've seen some organizations who've got a purpose and a vision in one sentence. And I'll be very pragmatic about this. If it works for you and you kind of put it into one thing, great. But think about it. Think about what would be useful. When I put the book together, my point was then make something practical and useful. Don't say you have to do this. You have to call it that. I've got people saying, well, we call it a mission and not a purpose. So, well, that's fine. In fact, you don't need to call it either of those two words. I remember working with a senior leadership team, and it got to lunchtime on an away day, and we were using purpose and vision and strategy and strategic priorities. And the CEO of the groups said after lunch, he said, Ian, we've got to stop using this management BS. And I said, great, tell me more. He said, it's fine for us here, but when we go out to our staff, and that's not to say they don't understand this stuff, but we're going to turn them off. So what they said is we're going to go out there and actually say, why we exist is to, and then what they decided, where we want to be is, and then what we decided, how we're going to behave is, and what we decided, our values, and how we're different, our strategy. They didn't use any of the classic management terms. And I thought, great, do you know what? There are no real rules here. If it works for you, if you can put a purpose in with a vision, all I would do is say, think about it. Have a conscious choice.
Yeah, really good, really good. Okay, so moving on just a step, the second part of the map is around people and teams. So that's something that's really dear to my heart, in that, we very much believe at Breathe that people are at the heart of the organization, and if you look after your people, they look after the rest. Quoting Richard Branson there. You kick this off really interestingly with the idea of challenging the status quo. And I know that's sort of the center of your TED talk. Why challenge the status quo when it comes to your people and your teams?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it kind of sits at the heart of my own journey, I suppose, which is why I feel so strongly about it. Now, there are some people in organizations who are very comfortable sitting in their status quo. The big question for me, which is a bit of a rhetorical one, is can people totally stay in their status quo anyway? Don't we have to move a bit? Don't we have to learn a bit? Some people learn enormously, and they grow and they change and they develop. Some people learn a tiny bit. Some people find it difficult to move outside their status quo. It's their comfort zone. And there's maybe nothing wrong with that to some extent. The danger is the longer people stay in the status quo, in their comfort zone, the harder it is to move them outside of that. And if you think about yourself, it can be the same. We all know people in our lives, maybe friends, maybe people, colleagues, who find it quite difficult to change. They're fearful of the change. They might make a mistake, and that brings us on to some of the great books out there, like Fear Less by Pippa Grange, which is all about how we're driven by fear of going outside our comfort zone, because we're fear of rejection, we're fear of criticism, we're fear of getting it wrong, we're fear of losing. And but the thing is, as I've discovered personally, so when I did my TED Talk, which you talked about earlier, my TEDx, I was the most nervous I've ever been. And when I applied to do that, I was way outside my comfort zone. I never saw myself. The story I told myself was, this is for other people. I don't do this kind of thing. And then I found myself doing it because I thought, no, I've got to live the message I'm putting out there. I can't not do this. And I had a message I wanted to put out in the TEDx I did. And I was really, really nervous. And I can remember vividly standing at the back of the room, doing an Amy Cuddy power pose before I went, because it was all dark at the back and nobody could see me. And I came to the front, I got up there and I did it, and it went okay. I got away with it, as they say. But afterwards, do you know what? You could have put me in Wembley Stadium with 100,000 people. I had grown, I had developed, I had gone outside my comfort or my status quo into my stretch, and I had grown as a person. And I think the biggest thing as a leader, and you'll know, Jonathan, about this because you care passionate about people and you want to grow your leadership team. The biggest thing about being a leader, I think, is to see somebody change and grow in front of your eyes and look at them and think, I've been a part of that, even a small part of that. And they've blossomed, they've grown, they're having new conversations, they're reading new books. And that, for me, is the journey I'm on and I love. And I love to see somebody say, they've started off, they didn't know what TED was, they haven't read many books, they don't go onto podcasts, they don't do a lot of learning, they've done a little bit. And then a couple of years later, they're saying, oh, do you know, I just heard Brené Brown's podcast with Jim Collins, fascinating. We have a conversation about it, and they're applying that in their world, in their business world.
Yeah.
I love that. So this business of going from status quo to stretch to getting outside your comfort zone, I think it's really important for all of us.
And I think there's one there that we can tie it back in. It's very, very relevant to now with us all starting to come out of lockdown, in that I'm a big believer if people stay in their comfort zone for a long time, their comfort zone actually gets smaller. So if we're all locked down and in our houses, and albeit working from our houses, it's very real. People are not used to doing the things that 2 years ago they'd have thought nothing about.
Yeah.
So I think as leaders, as we start to encourage people back out and the things that are going on that we used to do as a given, we need to actually be well aware. We need to put ourselves in the other person's shoes and say, actually, this isn't so normal for you now.
Yeah. And the only way they're going to do that, I think, kind of building on this, and it ties into the vulnerability and the trust and all those other things I've spoken about, is you've got to create a safety net for people. If you're a leader, you can't just expect people to jump and do things which are way outside their comfort zone. They won't do it unless you've created this safety, as Simon Sinek talks about a lot, this sort of safety for people. And you're going to create that through developing trust and having great conversations with them and feeling they've got their back, and not criticizing people when they try something and they maybe fail. Actually, that's just feedback. So you have got, people won't just do this on their own.
There's a question come in from Lawrence. Why are we always trying to push employees out of the box or out of their comfort zone? Why are we obsessed with constant change? If we've got people who are happy to stay within their comfort zone, isn't that okay?
I think it is okay. And I think for some people, and this is very individual, it's a bit like motivation. You can't sort of, I'm going to motivate everyone today. It doesn't happen like that. You have to look, as a leader, you have to look individually at the people you've got. And, some of them, a really small change would be something that's fine for them. And do you know what? They come in, they do a great job for you. They do 9 to 5. Absolutely fine. the anxiety can step in as if they think they're supposed to step outside their comfort zone, or they're supposed to be stretching themselves, or they're supposed to be doing all this stuff. And so it's an individual thing. And Lawrence is absolutely right. For some people, they're so driven to want to keep stepping outside the comfort zone and do more. Those are maybe your A players who you've really got to have a plan for, and you've got to help them get there and give them more challenging jobs, and they'll really grow your business. But I completely agree with what Lawrence is saying there, which is you can't have an organization with everyone constantly running around getting outside their comfort zone or the status quo, because it would be chaotic. But the good news is you won't find loads and loads of people who want to do that. In fact, the people who really want to stretch and grow your business are probably a minority of people. The vast majority of people want to stretch and grow a little bit, which is normal for all of us. And there are some who don't want to do it at all. And I think personally, that's a bit of a danger if they really don't want to do it at all. I think even small changes, small bits of growth, reading a bit here, listening to a blog over here, before you know it, you've got new concepts, new ideas. You're starting to push yourself a little bit. So I think it is a bit dangerous kind of at that end if people aren't growing at all. But I agree with the sentiment. Most people in organizations grow a little bit, and there are some who want to grow a lot. And they're the ones who probably help take our organizations forward much faster.
Yeah, no, I get it. But great question and very valid. Moving on slightly, it's still staying within people and teams. You talk about the dream team. What's the concept of a dream can't even say it, dream team?
Well, it was a kind of combination of bringing together, I've been a big fan of Patrick Lencioni's work for years, and Five Dysfunction of the Team. It was a book I will keep recommending to people all over the place. And I still do. What I added to that was things like safety, which I've talked about already, and building on Lencioni's view. He talks about vulnerability-based trust, which is key. And I think I've already mentioned Brené Brown, who's fantastic, great TED Talk if you're interested in vulnerability, trust. She talks about shame. Fantastic speaker, great podcast. She interviews some fantastic people. It's a great resource for people to go into. And she really unlocked the whole world of vulnerability for me, which is going back to our sort of earlier conversation about stretch. When we're going outside our comfort zone, we're being vulnerable. Whether that's telling people that we are not coping well in the pandemic and we feel anxious about returning to work, or whether that's standing on a stage and talking about Breathe to a big conference. Both of those are being vulnerable. Both of those build ourselves as human beings, and both of those mean we can probably go again. What they do is they build trust between people. So if I open up with you, Jonathan, and we've opened up a lot in our conversations over the past, we know each other really well, guess what? That builds trust between us.
Yep.
And that trust means we can turn around and challenge each other quite openly. And we do. I'll challenge you in our coaching conversations. You'll challenge me back on what I've said. And we can do that because we've got this real basis of trust between us that's built up over the years, over showing some vulnerability and showing who we really are. When the challenge comes to play and the challenge is put on the table, and think of a leadership team, we've now built up the trust around the table, we're open with each other, we've put some really challenging questions there, and we've talked about the most important things we could talk about today. And that's a great question for a leadership team. What's the most important thing we could talk about today, rather than the agenda we came in the room with? And let's not have, I can't remember who it was listening to today, said the worst organizations have a meeting after a meeting. and we should never have a meeting after a meeting. We should have the meeting in the meeting. We should have the conversation in the meeting. So when we've got the trust, when we've got the vulnerability there, when we're open with each other, we get the proper conversations on the table. We challenge each other. What happens when we challenge each other? We get deep into a real proper conversation that affects our business in a real way. We come to real actions out the back of it that we're passionate about. Lencioni says we don't weigh in, we don't buy in. So we have to weigh into a conversation. And we get those real actions that come out. And then what happens is we all want to see them pursued because we've all bought in, we've all had that discussion. It's a real issue for the business. We want to see them pursued and we want to see actions taken. So guess what? Commitment and accountability just flow out of those conversations. Obviously, we need a process in there that says, well, I'm going to follow up with you. But people are committed because they've done it in a team. Peer accountability is so much stronger than me holding you accountable because it's the group. The group come back together and say, did you do that? Did it happen? Yep. And out of all that, you get great team results. That is my team excellence model that I've just described there, and that is a dream team. If you can create that, which is, it sounds easy, doesn't it? Explaining it in a model like that. It's explained brilliantly in Lencioni. Sinek talks about the safety. Brené Brown talks about the vulnerability, as well as Sinek, as well as Lencioni, sorry. So, but a model like that really is at the heart of trying to create a team that is high performing.
Yeah. Question that just came in there from Andy, didn't catch the name of the book. I think the time when you asked the question, I think it was Patrick Lencioni, Five Dysfunctions of a Team. Yeah. Awesome book. I've got it on Audible. Yeah. Listen to it every 6-9 months. Yeah. Really good book, really good one to listen to.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple more questions that I just want to cover off. Laura's saying, how do you identify your A players? Controversial term because that's suggesting a hierarchy. I know it's a term that you use, so I'm not saying you are.
I know. You got to be careful, haven't you? Well, I think that A players almost always identify themselves to you, I would say. A players are usually the ones who come into your office and say, I've got a great idea. I want to, how about we do this? They've got lots of energy. They've got lots of ideas. And they want to achieve stuff for you. You know, they're kind of almost entrepreneurial in their spirit. They want to get on and they understand the vision and where you're going. They might be, you know, they might have too much energy and not enough structure in some ways. And some of them would need to be held back a bit and they'd need to be made sure that what they're doing is in line with where we want to take the business and they don't go off on a tangent. But, you know, if you create the environment for people, if you create the environment of creating safety and you challenge people and you support people and you show you care for people as a leader, that creates the environment for A players to come up and stand out. And, you know, when you recruit, you can see that if you've got a great recruitment process, you can see, wow, this person's really going to add something here. They've got something extra. And you should be able to see it through the recruitment and the induction process, and they'll begin to take your business in the direction you want. And as I said earlier, you can't have everyone, but then you won't find tons of these people around.
Yeah. One thing I always try and hang on to with the idea of sort of A, B, C players, whatever, is that an A player isn't fixed. Somebody's not, and if they're an A player now, they don't always have to be an A player, and that's perfectly good. So there's a couple of things I know that you're big on is the idea of Jim Collins, right person, you know, right people on the bus and then in the right seat.
Yeah.
So you can get somebody who's right for the organization, but they're maybe not in the right seat.
Yeah.
And they're not doing the right role, or, you know, something needs to change.
Absolutely.
But the other thing that I feel really strong on as you know, as I do around the idea of people first is situations change. Yeah. Somebody who's with me today and is an A player, their situation's going to change. Life goes up and down. You know, we start families. We go through different stages in our lives, and just because somebody's not an A player today doesn't mean to say they can't be an A player tomorrow.
Absolutely. And B players become A players, and A players become B players, and C players, if we're going to go that far, who maybe aren't performing very well, they may be a bit dissatisfied, they may be a bit demotivated, they may be spreading disharmony. Do you know what? They can become A players too. It's our job as leaders to look across the piece and say, what have we got here? How do we help people? How do we motivate them? It's all very individual, but I've seen C players, that people might not use that term, but people really who aren't performing very well become A players because they've had development, care, attention, motivation put on them, and a really good lot of one-to-ones and attention, and suddenly they've woken up, they feel they're cared for, and they change their spots, as it were.
And here's the question coming from Annette, if I sort of paraphrase it slightly, is it that the A players get all the attention and all the special treatment? How do you maintain the fairness? Is it about fairness?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so to be honest, you're not going to get a huge amount of A players, I don't think, in an organization, but you do need to have a plan for them. You do need to manage them and lead them carefully. You do need to have one-to-ones with them because they're going to make a difference in your organization. However, leadership's tough. I think I say that right at the beginning of the book. If you're doing leadership really well, it's really hard. Because you can't just focus on the A players. You've got to focus on your organization. You've got to communicate really well. You've got to care for lots of people. One of the things as a leader, you can't have too many people that directly report to you. That's another. I'm working with a company at the moment, and the CEO's got 11 people reporting to him. Now, that's tough. How can you do one-to-ones with 11 people and develop? And I always think 5, 6 is probably the maximum as a leader. But with those 5, 6, let's say you've got a couple of real A players in there. Of course, you don't ignore the others. You've got to have regular one-to-ones, and that's a passionate thing about you, Jonathan. And all the stats would say we've got to be checking in with people weekly and discussing informally and giving them feedback and praise, and talk to them about what they're doing well and what they perhaps could improve upon on a weekly basis. And so you've got to be thinking about your A players, because if they go, you know what it's like, somebody who you take for granted, who's doing really well, who you're loving in your business, comes in and said, I've got another job. Because the thing is about an A player is they can go and work for lots of people. They're really good. And so financially and strategically, you don't want to lose too many A players. So you have got to pay attention to them.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you don't pay attention to the others. You've got to do both. You've got to do both as a leader.
I think maybe sometimes being an A player in an organization can be potentially the unfair place to be, because if you're in there and you're saying, give me more, give me more, give me more, I want more responsibility, I want more pressure, that you can get an unfair amount of work to do. But that's somewhat what the person who chooses it's their moment to that's what they have to put up with.
Yeah.
Look, so much to cover again. You touched on the subject of one-to-one, which sort of takes me onto the idea of meetings, which every organization, they have their meetings, and meetings good or bad? Start with that question mark.
Yeah, I mean, meetings for an awful lot of organizations are awful places to be in. They just, and I always say the interesting about meetings is, and we were chatting earlier, and I said to you, I just ran a full day workshop with a leadership team on how to run meetings. And I started off by saying, this is not a sexy subject, but it's so important. And we ran the day, and I got great feedback, and they're implementing a lot of stuff. So meetings aren't done well in a lot of organizations. Why is that? I don't think people are trained in what a good meeting looks like. I think the danger is one day you're in meetings and your boss is running them, and that's how you think meetings are run. And if your boss isn't running good meetings, you're kind of like, there's my standard. It's like, okay, well, that meetings aren't necessarily good then. And so you carry on. But actually, there are frameworks, there are tools, there are techniques, there are ways of running a meeting. The best bit of advice I've ever got about a meeting, and we can talk about meetings all day, as I did recently. There are all sorts of types of meetings you should run, from tactical to strategic, and you should never mix tactical and strategic together. And you've got daily huddles, and you've got weekly tacticals, and you've got monthly strategic, and you've got offsite retreats. So there's lots of different meetings. But probably the most interesting about me is, how do you run a great meeting? For most people, they go, how do I run a great meeting? And the best bit of advice I ever got is, a meeting should be like the best Bond movie you ever saw. Okay. Now that sounds a bit weird, right? But let's think about it. A Bond movie, what does it do? It starts with an action sequence, right? So Bond is in a helicopter above Mexico City fighting a baddie. And, you know, the helicopter's going upside down and it's going all over the place. In the end, Bond kills the baddie, falls out the helicopter. He lands the helicopter. And the next bit, he's back in London talking to M, who's giving him a telling off. And the film starts. What's happened? It's got your attention. You're right in it. Where's this going to go? This is really interesting. That's how your meeting should start. Not with a helicopter above Mexico City, but should start with a bang. They should start with something interesting. Don't start with, let's have a look at the figures from last month. Because people are going to go, oh my God, why didn't you send out the figures from last month before you started the meeting? Let's start the meeting with an interesting fact or a customer story or a product we're launching, something that's going to engage the audience in that room. And then let's make sure why we're having the meeting. Let's be sure of the purpose of the meeting. Let's be sure on the agenda of the meeting. If you've got introverts, we talked about those earlier, didn't we? Introverts versus extroverts. Introverts hate not having an agenda. It freaks them out. They want to know what we're going to do when we come into the meeting. So you need some sort of agenda. It might be not timed, but you need an agenda. You need the purpose for the meeting. You need to know who's going to be in the meeting. Normally meetings have too many people in. Steve Jobs was brilliant about saying, why are you in this meeting? Oh, my boss told me to come. Well, you don't need to be here. You can leave now. You know, you can pare down meetings. As a leader, here's a really good tip. Don't go to every meeting you're invited to. Go to the start. Go to the end. Don't go to it at all. Ask for the person who ran the meeting to come and tell you how it went and what the action outcomes were. So it's time. We don't get any more time as a leader. Think about how you're spending your time and think carefully. Great book on meetings, Patrick Lencioni, Death by Meeting. Fabulous book. Give you everything you need to know on running a meeting.
Yep, absolutely. And there's a question came in a while ago from Michael. What do you think is the most important sphere to be excellent at? I've been trying to find a place to slot that question in.
Well, as a leader.
But yeah, being excellent at meetings, I think, and actually maybe broaden it a little bit. For me personally, it's all about focusing on your people. If you can be excellent at being with your people, as walking a mile in their shoes and understanding where it's going, then you're perfectly positioned to actually to let them run the business for you.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I think the people skills are the big thing. And if you look at how much time you spend as a leader dealing with people issues, people development, growing your people, challenging your people, it should be a big chunk of your time. The other thing I would say to balance that is every leader I've worked with who's, you know, the head of a team or the head of an organization will not have every skill that we talk about. And the key thing about a leader is knowing to get that person or people alongside them with the complementary skills that you don't necessarily have in abundance.
Yep.
That's really critical. I had somebody say to me the other day, I'd love to be a CEO one day, but I feel I'm really good at strategy and finance. I'm not so good at the people stuff. And I said, well, the fact you've recognized that's great because you can start to grow that. But who would you have in your leadership team? You'd have somebody who's really good at that, who'll complement you in those skills. Yep. And so look at any of the great leaders around the world, they don't have everything. And, you know, nor do I, nor do you, nor does the next leader. So having a team, again, is so important around you.
An early person I worked for early in my career said you should never recruit anybody that doesn't threaten you.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice.
Look, time is romping on, and there's couple more bits I want to get into. A little bit on grit, because you know your podcast called The Gritty Leaders. I guess the reference there is to the bit of grit in the oyster. Is that right? Where...
Yeah, we wanted to have a, you know, as we do. Ben and I never agree on anything. So we wanted to have a bit of grit in there. And I think, you know, leadership is, as I said, it's tough. You've got to be really resilient. You've got to want to be a leader. You know, this is tough stuff. It's a tough journey. You've got to build up resilience. Passion and perseverance for long-term goals is what Angela Duckworth, great TED Talk, great book, describes grit as. An awful lot out there about grit and resilience now. And I think as leaders, we kind of feel we should have it, you know. But we've got to be honest as well. And, you know, mental health is a big thing. We've got to balance our lives. We've got to figure out how to get it. I mean, one of the things we talked about earlier, stepping outside our comfort zone, one of the things about becoming grittier, more resilient, is we put ourselves slowly into more pressure situations, and it becomes easier to cope with them. I mean, you look at Emma Raducanu, who just won the US Open. My gosh, what a resilient girl. Absolutely outstanding. And why is that? Why is she so resilient? Well, she's probably been through this high stress all her life.
And then look at the lesson she learned at Wimbledon.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was crucial, because she knew at the time, she had the self-awareness to go, stop, step back. And she clearly had a lot of people around her looking after her, because for some people that would affect them deeply for a long period of time, but she bounced back relatively quickly, and then she won the US Open. So resilience is something we've got to notice in ourselves, but the more we push ourselves, I mean, the kind of in our own time, and I've talked about this, not everyone can push themselves massively at our own pace as well, the grittier we'll become. But going back to Angela Duckworth's definition, long-term goals, if we really want to get something in our life, we tend to get through things on the way to that vision. And that goes back to why you should have a vision, because you can sit there with your leadership team and say, we've said in 3 years' time, we want to be this big, this great, this bold, have these many products, these many services. Right, guys, how are we going to get there? And suddenly you find ways, you're creative, you move towards that. And you get problems along the route, you get challenges along the route, and then you figure out how to overcome them, because you will desperately want to get to that vision. And for people like Emma Raducanu and individuals, we need our own vision of where we want to go to, and the grit, the resilience we build up along the route, and the care and attention and the people around us who support us, and we need all that. Really important as a leader to notice that in your people too. You know, are they coping, especially now? So it's a big deal, you know, this grit and resilience stuff, and leaders need it in abundance.
And I think that's, you know, if we want to look for the good things to come out of the pandemic and lockdown, I think we've all become quite a lot more resilient.
Yeah.
We've learned how to handle things in a way that we wouldn't have done before. So yeah. Grit's a really important one. All right, so the last sort of topic, we've only got a few minutes left. So, you know, maybe we've left the most important one till last, which is execution.
Yeah.
So the having the strategy, the having the right people, you know, getting everybody on the bus in the right seats. If we don't actually turn the bus on and go somewhere, then maybe we're missing something. Strategic priorities.
Yeah.
What are they?
Well, so I'll go back to having a session with a group years ago. I ran a senior leadership team, and I said, so I'm asked quite often to come and run sessions on, can we create our goals for next year? And I'd call them strategic priorities. And I say, yep, that's great. Can you send me in advance your purpose, your vision, your values, this year's goals, targets, measures, and historically what you've done over the last, say, 5-6 years, and then your leadership team, your capacity, your capability, anything you've got in the market and how that's evolving and how that's changing. The last time you did a SWOT analysis, maybe a pestle analysis, maybe a Porter's 5 forces. I want to know a lot of information because otherwise you're doing this in a kind of bubble. Because what you're doing is saying, what are we going to do over a period of time? That's your strategic priorities. What are we going to do over a period of time? And unless you've got those things in place, you do need to know what's happening in the market. You do need to know what your strategy is. You need to know what your vision is, because that's what we want to go towards. And if you've got all those things, and often when I run an away day with people, I get them all on the wall. I put all those things around the wall and say, look, there's our vision over there. Here's last year's strategic priorities. This is what we've done over the last 5 years. These are the trends. And then you get people in the leadership team to have done a SWOT of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So we can look at our internal capabilities, the external market, the competition, and so on. Within that framework, we can now say, what do we want to do next year? We can have a creative session followed by something that starts to pin it down over several months that says, this is the big projects. These are the big markets we're going in to do. this is the new things we're going to create. These are the systems and processes we needed to underpin that. This is our people strategy, and these are the resources we need to bring in. So these are some people call the big rocks we're going to do next year. We need to know exactly what they are. We need to have a real plan about them. We need to have one person accountable for each of them. We need to have the right KPIs and measures behind them and right targets. And everyone on the senior leadership team needs to know what everyone else's is. So this is the key. It's not like, well, I only need to know marketing because I'm in marketing. Everyone needs to know everyone else so they can challenge and support. And of course, when you've got them created, you need to monitor them through your great meetings every month and quarterly. And then you need to cascade them and engage the whole organization in them so that they can join the dots from where they sit in the organization to the strategic priorities. And that's down to their team leader to help them understand what they do fits with where the business is going. And then they start to buy in and understand it and not see it as kind of disassociated from what they're actually doing. So complicated piece, so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key piece there that you were explaining it was it's the link between the ultimate vision and the person who has to do the work to achieve the vision. Yeah. So they will help you achieve the vision, but they will also need to know what the vision is to know really whether they want to get on board.
Without a vision, every road will take you there. It's that kind of, you know, we could just do something and it might be good, but may not take us where we want to go.
Nice. Look, got loads more we could talk about. I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. We're a few minutes away from 12 o'clock. Been fantastic, Ian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Couple of things I'd say, you know, some standout points for me was, one bit was that you were saying start the meeting with a bang. Mm-hmm. You're right. So often we start meetings with a so that was a fantastic one. And a whole bunch in there. A couple of minutes on resources. Where would you say people would go to learn? You know, we've had a question in from Laura, books, TED Talks, podcasts, etc. I mean, we'll put together a list of everything that's been researched, and we'll make sure that gets out to everybody. But what 2 or 3 resources?
Well, Jim Collins, I'm a huge fan of Jim Collins, as you are, Jonathan. Buy Jim Collins's latest book, BE 2.0. It's fantastic. Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions, we talked about that, or Lencioni's The Advantage. TED Talks, if you're not into TED Talks, go and look at some TED Talks. They are just amazing. Amy Cuddy's TED Talk, Brené Brown's TED Talk, Simon Sinek's TED Talk. There's loads of them out there. Podcasts, podcasts are great because they're free, you know. So are TED Talks. Yeah. There's some great stuff there.
Okay, so tell you what, how about if you can spare it, you and I over the next few days, we'll put together a reading list or a recommendation list, and we'll try and pick out everything we've mentioned here and maybe a few more.
Sure.
And then we can share that with everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. So resources we've done. Is a challenging one for you. One thing that people should do next week to become a better leader.
So
on the basis there's no golden bullet.
I wish there was one thing you could do. My view is leaders, as is one of your values, have a growth mindset. So what I would say is do one thing. It doesn't matter what it is. If you go and buy Jim Collins's book and start reading it that I've recommended, or if you go and watch Brené Brown's TED Talk or Amy Cuddy's TED Talk on presence, or you download a podcast and listen to, you know, Adam Grant on Brené Brown's podcast. Do one thing. Get on that learning journey. Make sure you're accessing TED, blogs, books, because to me, and you see I'm passionate about this stuff, this is about your life. It will change your life. You'll just understand more about who you are and what you can do with your life, never mind your business, which is what, of course, the outcome will be too.
Very last thing, how can people get hold of you?
Email ian@ianwindle.com or go on my website, ianwindle.com. And just get in touch anytime. Love to hear from people.
I'm sure you're on LinkedIn, and then there's the Gritty Leaders Club, the podcast.
I've got the podcast and a blog. It's all accessible through my website. So yeah.
Awesome. Want to be respectful of everybody's time. So thank you, Ian, again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hope you found it useful. We will be sending out the podcast. I've committed us to sending you out a list of resources. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, and see you soon.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Cheers, Ian.